Simon's father, Guy de Maupassant. The clock struck 12. The school doors burst open, and the boys, jostling and rushing, poured out into the street in a noisy crowd. But instead of scattering to their homes as usual, where lunch awaited them, they lingered a few steps from the school, formed a circle, and began whispering among themselves. That day, Simon, the son of Blanchot, had appeared at school for the first time. Each of the boys had heard talk about Blanchot at home. In public, people treated her politely, but behind her back, the women spoke with a haughty kind of pity, tinged with contempt. This attitude had seeped into the children, though they had no idea why. None of them knew Simon. He had never come outside, never run with them through the village lanes or played by the river. Naturally, they couldn't feel any affection for him. On the contrary, they passed along a piece of gossip with a mix of curiosity and secret delight, words spoken by a boy of about 14, who seemed to know a great deal. He winked slyly as he shared the news. "Did you hear? Simon, he doesn't have a father." Just then, Blanchot's son appeared in the doorway. He was 7 or 8 years old. Pale, neatly dressed, he looked timid and slightly awkward. He turned toward home, but the boys, exchanging glances and whispers, their eyes gleaming with cruel amusement, began to surround him, tightening the circle. Simon stopped, confused and frightened, not understanding what they wanted. Then the same boy who had spread the rumor, pleased with the attention, asked, "What's your name?" "Simon," he replied. "Simon what?" The interrogation continued. The child, completely flustered, repeated, "Simon. Who's called just Simon? That's only a first name." Simon, his eyes filling with tears, whispered for the third time, "My name is Simon." Laughter erupted. The triumphant boy shouted, "See! He really doesn't have a father." A heavy silence fell. The children stood stunned by this strange, impossible, almost monstrous fact, a boy without a father. They stared at him as if he were something supernatural, and felt within themselves the stirrings of that same contempt their mothers held for Blanchot. Simon, equally shaken, leaned against a tree, afraid he might collapse under the weight of this sudden misfortune. He wanted to explain, but couldn't find the words, didn't know how to refute the terrible accusation. Flushing red, he cried out, "That's not true. I do have a father." "Where is he then?" asked the boy. Simon said nothing, he didn't know. The boys laughed, excited and cruel. These children, raised among fields and still close to animal instinct, felt the same savage urge that drives hens to peck at the wounded among them. Suddenly, Simon spotted his neighbor, the son of a widow who also lived alone with his mother, and asked, "And you don't have a father either, do you?" "No," the boy replied, "but I do." "Where is he?" "My father is dead," the boy said proudly. "He's buried in the cemetery." A murmur of approval swept through the group as if the fact that the boy's father lay in the grave elevated him, and utterly destroyed Simon, who had no father at all. And these boys, whose fathers were often drunkards, brutes, or thieves, began to press closer, as if the legitimate children meant to crush the illegitimate one. Suddenly, one of them, standing nearest to Simon, stuck out his tongue and shouted, "No papa! No papa!" Simon grabbed him by the hair and began kicking him, while the other bit him hard on the cheek. A vicious fight broke out. They were pulled apart, and Simon, beaten and filthy, found himself once again in the circle of boys who applauded loudly. He stood up, brushing off his blouse with trembling hands, when someone shouted, "Go on then, complain to your papa." At that moment, Simon felt with all his heart, there was no escape. They were stronger. They had beaten him. And he couldn't defend himself, not with words, not with truth, for he knew perfectly well that they were right. He truly had no father. Out of pride, he tried to hold back the tears that choked him. But a spasm seized his throat, and he began to cry, silently, convulsively, his whole body trembling with sobs. This sight filled the boys with savage delight. Like little savages, they grabbed each other's hands and began to dance around him, chanting in unison, "No papa! No papa!" Suddenly, Simon stopped crying. Rage overtook him. At his feet lay a few stones, and he began hurling them at his tormentors. He struck 2 or 3, who fled in tears. His face was so terrifying that panic spread among the rest. As often happens with a crowd confronted by the fury of despair, they scattered quickly. And so the child without a father ran off into the fields. A memory flashed through his mind, leading him to a grim decision: he would drown himself. Just a week earlier, a beggar who lived on alms had thrown himself into the river because he had not a single coin left. Simon had been on the riverbank when they pulled him out. That poor man, always pitiful and shabby, had struck Simon then with the calm expression on his pale face, framed by a wet beard, and his wide, unmoving eyes. People around had said, "He's dead." And someone added, "Well, now he's at peace." Simon had wanted to drown too, because he had no father, just as that beggar had no money. He approached the water and stared into its clear ripples. A few nimble fish darted about, occasionally leaping to snatch flies hovering over the surface. Their movements fascinated Simon so much that he forgot his tears for a moment. But like a storm returning after a lull, the same thought came back to him in waves of despair. "I'll drown myself, because I have no papa." It was hot and quiet. The sun warmed the grass, and the water shimmered like a mirror. Simon felt that sweet exhaustion that follows crying, and he wanted nothing more than to lie down in the sun and sleep. Suddenly, a small green frog jumped near his feet. He tried to catch it, but it slipped away. 3 times he lunged after it, each time in vain. At last, he grabbed it by its hind legs and laughed, watching it struggle. The frog bent its long legs, springy like coils, then snapped them straight, bulging its round eyes rimmed with gold, and flailed its front legs in the air like hands. It reminded him of a toy wooden slats joined in zigzag fashion, making little soldiers on top move as if drilling. Then he thought of home, of his mother. A wave of sorrow swept over him, and he began to cry again. A cold shiver ran through his body. He knelt down and began to pray, as he did before bed. But he couldn't finish, the sobs came back, fast and fierce, nearly choking him. He no longer saw or thought of anything, he only wept. Suddenly, a heavy hand rested on his shoulder, and a voice asked, "What's troubling you so badly, little one?" Simon turned around. Before him stood a tall, bearded man with curly black hair. Gasping through his tears, the boy replied, "They beat me, because I don't have a papa." "How can that be?" the man asked gently, smiling. "Everyone has a papa." "But I don't," the child sobbed. The man's face grew serious. He recognized Blanchot's son. Though he was new to the village, he had already heard whispers of her story. "Come on," he said. "Don't cry. Let's go to your mother. We'll find you a papa." They walked together. The man held the boy's hand and smiled, curious to meet the famous Blanchot, said to be one of the prettiest girls in the village. And perhaps, deep down, a thought stirred: if she had sinned once, she might sin again. They reached a neat little cottage. "This is it," said Simon, and called out, "Mama." A woman appeared in the doorway. The man's smile vanished. He immediately understood. This tall, pale, solemn young woman was not one to be trifled with. She stood as if guarding the threshold where she had once been betrayed. Removing his cap, he said quietly, "I brought your son. He got lost by the river." But Simon threw himself into his mother's arms and cried, "No, Mama, I wanted to drown, because the boys beat me, for not having a papa." Her cheeks flushed crimson. She embraced him fiercely, and tears welled in her eyes. The man stood awkwardly, unsure how to leave. Suddenly, Simon ran up to him and asked, "Do you want to be my papa?" Silence fell. Blanchot, burning with shame, leaned against the wall, clutching her heart. The boy, seeing no reply, added, "Well, if you don't want to, I'll go drown myself again." The man laughed, turning it into a joke. Yes, of course I do." "What's your name?" asked Simon. "I need to know, in case someone asks." "Philippe," the man replied. Simon fell silent, trying to memorize the name. Then he reached out his arms and said, "Well then, that's perfect. So, Philippe, you're my papa." The man lifted him up, kissed both his cheeks warmly, turned, and hurried away. The next day, Simon's arrival at school was met with mocking laughter. And when, after lessons, the same boy began to tease him again, Simon, as if casting a stone into silence, firmly declared, "My papa's name is Philippe." A burst of laughter erupted from all sides. "Philippe? What Philippe? Who's this Philippe? Where did you dig up your Philippe?" Simon said nothing. He stood his ground, eyes unwavering, with a defiant resolve ready to be struck down rather than retreat. The teacher intervened, and soon Simon was walking home to his mother. For 3 months, the tall worker named Philippe often passed by Blanchot's house. Occasionally, if he saw her sewing by the window, he dared to speak to her. She always replied politely, but with restraint, never smiling, never inviting him in. Yet, as men often do, he imagined she blushed a little more than usual when speaking to him. A reputation, once lost, is hard to reclaim. It remains fragile forever. And though Blanchot carried herself with dignity, rumors had already begun to spread through the village. Simon, meanwhile, had grown deeply attached to his new papa. Nearly every evening, after school, they walked together. The boy studied diligently and held himself with quiet pride, never responding to mockery. But one day, the same boy who had first provoked him came up again. "You lied. You don't have a papa. Philippe doesn't count." "Why not?" asked Simon, visibly shaken. "Because if he were your papa, he'd be married to your mama." Simon faltered. The logic was undeniable. Yet he replied, "He's still my papa." "Maybe," the boy sneered, "but not a real one." Simon lowered his head and, lost in thought, made his way to old Loisen's forge, where Philippe worked. The forge lay hidden beneath thick trees. Inside, it was dim, lit only by the red glow of the furnace. 5 blacksmiths stood in the firelight, hammering their anvils with thunderous blows. They looked like demons, their eyes fixed on the glowing iron. Their heavy thoughts seemed to move in rhythm with the rise and fall of their hammers. Simon slipped in unnoticed and gently tugged at Philippe's sleeve. He turned. The work stopped, and the blacksmiths turned their curious eyes toward the boy. In the hush that followed, Simon's clear, childlike voice rang out. "Philippe, you know, Michaud said you're not my papa." "Why's that?" asked the worker. "Because you're not married to my mama," the child replied innocently. No one laughed. Philippe remained still, his head bowed over the hands that gripped the hammer resting on the anvil. He was thinking. The other 4 exchanged glances, while Simon, tiny among these giants, waited eagerly for a reply. Suddenly, one of the blacksmiths, voicing what they all seemed to feel, said, "Blancot is an honest, hard-working girl. Despite her misfortune, she's modest and dignified. She'd make a fine wife for a decent man." "That's true," the others agreed. The same man continued, "It's not her fault she was deceived. She was promised marriage. I know plenty of women who've been in her shoes and are now respected by everyone." "Exactly," the blacksmiths echoed. He added, "She's suffered so much, poor thing, raising her boy alone. How many tears she's shed since she shut herself away and only goes out to church, only God knows." "That's the truth," came the reply. Silence returned, broken only by the hiss of the bellows feeding the fire. Philippe turned sharply to Simon. "Tell your mama I'll come by this evening to speak with her." He gently placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and led him out of the forge. Philippe returned to his work, and soon all 5 hammers were ringing again. The blacksmiths worked until nightfall, strong, joyful, and absorbed. And like a cathedral bell that drowns out all others on feast days, Philippe's hammer stood out in the din, crashing down on the anvil with force. Surrounded by sparks, his eyes ablaze, he worked with passion. When stars lit the sky, he knocked on Blanchot's door. He wore a clean festive blouse, a fresh shirt, and his beard was neatly combed. The young woman appeared on the threshold and said, with quiet reproach, "It's not proper to come so late." He wanted to reply, but faltered and stood silently before her. She continued, "You must understand it's not right to give people reason to talk about me." Then he blurted out, "What does it matter, if you agree to be my wife?" She didn't answer, but he thought he heard a faint sound from inside, a body falling. He stepped in quickly. Simon, already in bed, heard a kiss and a few whispered words from his mother. Then he felt Philippe lift him high in his strong arms and shout, "Now you tell your schoolmates that your papa is Philippe Remy, the blacksmith, and he'll box the ears of anyone who dares to bully you." The next morning, before lessons began and with everyone present, Simon, pale and trembling with emotion, stood up and declared loudly, "My papa is Philippe Remy, the blacksmith, and he promised to pull the ears of anyone who picks on me." This time, no one laughed. Everyone knew Philippe Remy, the blacksmith, and he was the kind of father any boy would be proud to have. We go to the channel and select the next piece.